Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Understanding Ag team and Soil Health Academy, would like to welcome you to today's webinar. Unfortunately, Sarah Keogh fell ill, so instead of her presentation, we decided to do a question and answer session with the partners and consultants of Understanding Ag. We ask that you please put your device on mute when you are not speaking and type your questions into the question and answer box on the screen. This is going to be an open forum. We're going to take questions and go as long as we can. So any questions you may have for any of the partners or consultants of Understanding Ag, we will try and answer them to the best of our ability. We do have some questions that have been submitted via email, so we're going to start there. And Alan, I will start with you first. Nita from North Carolina wants to know a suggested minimum acreage to do rotational grazing, given the time needed to allow the pastured area to regenerate. So she says, in other words, she's asking you how many paddocks one has to have as a minimum.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Nita, for the question. And really the truth is it's more related to being able to get adequate rest and recovery in between grazings. That's really going to be the key question here and the key thing that has to be addressed. So for where you're located in North Carolina, if you want to have good diversity of plant species in those pastures, adequate recovery, and the ability to be able to really stimulate and build a lot of soil biology and soil aggregate for good water infiltration, you really need to have a minimum of 50 to 60 days rest in most of those pastures before you're going to go back and regraze them again. And oftentimes it may take longer than that, depending on the current condition. So that's really going to be what you have to take a look at. And if many of these farms are small acreage, then I'm going to make another suggestion. I know that you're probably referring to grazing of cattle on that acreage, but the truth is on many of the small acreage properties, you only have a handful of cattle at best, and it's very hard to generate any kind of significant net revenue with that. So I'm going to suggest that on these small acres, rather than looking at cattle, let's look at other species, smaller species that can work there. And the options are many. You know, poultry would work incredibly well on small acres, either broilers or laying hens or a combination thereof. You can also add seasonal turkey production. Other things that you can do, small ruminant production, sheep, goats can work very well on small acres. And then pastured pig production is also an option. In addition to that, you could add a few beehives and add some honey production as well. But again, to have production, good plant species diversity, and building a soil biology, you really want 50 to 60 days rest plus in those pastures before they have to come back around and graze again. Gabe, Shane, anything additional?
Thank you, Alan. I sure think you covered that well. The next question I will ask of Shane and then go on to David. Jim asks, aren't there 6 principles? The 6 would be remineralization through glaciers, volcanoes, and floods. Shane, do you want to talk about the nutrient cycle a bit?
Well, the nutrient cycle, immobilization, the mineralization. So, you know, basically we can look at the above ground and below ground and how they work. So basically when you have vegetation out there growing, and this is part of, we look at things look at the principles aspect. So when I have a living plant and we utilize that plant to provide cover, armor on the soil, those nutrients within inside that plant are immobilized. The only way we're going to capture that is through the microbiology mineralizing those nutrients and cycling them back through the system. The same thing works within the soil. That's where our predator to prey relationship. When you have a bacteria, which is very nutrient dense with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of like a 3:1 to 5:1, but then you have a protozoa come along that has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of a 15:1. He's got to consume, if the ratio of the bacteria is 3:1, 5 of those bacteria and those nutrients within inside that bacteria are immobilized. So after the protozoa consumes them, then the mineralization process occurs with the predator consuming the bacteria.
Thank you, Shane. David, could you expand on that a bit, please? Perhaps it would be best to explain a little bit to the attendees about the total nutrient digestion test and what we're seeing there.
Yeah, so one of the tests that we've been performing here in the last 18 months or so has been this total nutrient digestion, where we're taking a 12-inch soil core and we're looking at the organic and inorganic pools of nutrients in that soil profile. And so our standard soil test is only looking at the inorganic, quote unquote, plant available form, but we also have all of this organic complexes of minerals in there that they're bound with carbon, and really it takes microbes and plants to basically release this and make it available. And when we look at like our standard soil test or any soil test, if we're only looking at a 6-inch sample, that's given us a pretty small area of that soil profile that we're measuring the amount of nutrients or fertility that's in that soil profile. And as we know, those roots of those plants go much deeper than that. So they're actually, working with the biology down deeper into that soil profile to release these nutrients, bringing them back up into their plant tissue. And then as that plant is decaying and dies off and decays, it's laying it at the soil surface again. So, there's the Liebig's law of the minimum, which basically states, if we were to look at like a yield of corn or wheat or soybeans or anything like that, that if we thought of a wood stave or a wood bucket and we've got staves on it, the lowest stave, if we filled it up with water, is where all of that nutrient or the yield potential would leave. So we'd have to build up that nutrient. Well, there's also a law of the maximum, which is basically stating that if there's an excess of a nutrient, it could actually be antagonistic against one of those other nutrients and tying it up. So that could be the cause of, not having this nutrient cycling occurring. And then there's this law of return. And so what Shane is talking about, what I talked about earlier, is this law of return of these plant species pulling up these nutrients from deeper in the soil profile, bringing them up to the surface into the plant tissue. And as long as we're not removing that plant tissue with like haying or silage or anything like that, and removing it off of that field, where's it going to go? It's basically going to go right back into the soil. So we're starting to build that soil from the top down and bringing all of those nutrients up to build that nutrient profile.
Thank you, David. And if we may, David, is it not true that every field or paddock we've tested the total nutrient digestion on, there is plenty of nutrients in the soil for profitable production? Could you not explain then, please, that it's the biology that's lacking?
Oh, absolutely. In most of our soils, whether it's a row crop or even pasture land, depending on the grazed management, but we're seeing, the minimum of about 2,000 pounds of nitrogen and a minimum of 600 pounds of phosphorus and, several thousand pounds of potassium in that top 12 inches. And so as we start to build the biological system and we start to add more diversity of crop species, which is, and plant species, and then that's influencing more diversity in the microbial species, they're breaking down these carbon bonds in that soil. They're releasing these nutrients to be plant available. Nobody fertilizes the trees, but yet they grow so well. If we were to take out a grove of trees and plant crops there, that would be our best yielding areas always. Part of it's because of the carbon, but the biggest part is because of the biology that's there.
Thank you, David. And then Jim also wanted to know where we can get the total nutrient digestion test done. And we would suggest that you could get that done at Regen Ag Lab in Pleasanton, Nebraska. It is approximately a $70 test, I believe. Okay, Andrew asked a question of myself. He would like to know what we grow on our ranch for hog and chicken feed. Do we grow them together in the same field? And do we grind them prior to feeding the animals? So again, Andrew, this is about context. You have to take your context, your environment into account. Obviously here in North Dakota, although you couldn't tell it by the last few months, we're in a cool season environment. And so I'm going to grow primarily cool season species. What I found is working well for us is a mix of barley, oats, spring peas, faba beans, and flax. We grow them all together, we combine them together, and then feed them as a mix. Yes, we do run this through a grinder mixer for the hogs. And we've also found that it does benefit the poultry to run it through a mixer because they have a hard time with the peas, and faba beans are a bit large if we don't run them and crack them, at least break them up a little bit. To this, we do add some screenings from our other grain crops because many of these screenings, such as the foxtails, are very high in protein, which add to the ration for the poultry. We do not, quote unquote, balance a ration. What we found is that, yes, some years one of these 5 species may do a bit better than the others, but we found that performance and lay rate remains good with them. So that's what we've been using. Here is an excellent question for Alan, and Alan may not know this, but we just got the topic for our next webinar. Karen wants to know, when can Alan do a biblical history class and connect Regen Ag to biblical times? Alan, you want to talk about that?
So actually, I have been studying weekly on that for quite a while now and putting together quite a bit of materials with the intention that at some point we will write a book specifically addressing biblical stewardship. So I would be happy to schedule and do a webinar looking at scriptural interpretation of stewardship and how agriculture was conducted in biblical times, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how God intended for us to conduct agriculture and take care of this creation that he gave us. So I would be happy to do that, and we'll get something scheduled.
Thank you for that excellent question, Karen. The next question is from a friend of mine, Jason, and Jason writes, I'm trying to convert my family's 1,300 acres of corn soybean production in southwest Minnesota to a regenerative program. My grandfather's renter does 600 acres with regular tillage. We do have another renter doing no-till, but hesitant to do diverse covers. What is Understanding Ag's consulting approach to situations like this? And I'm going to stop there and call on David to answer that.
Yeah, so obviously in Minnesota, you're
Oh, did we lose
situation,
David?
especially. Can you
David,
hear me, Gabe?
Yeah, you broke up. Please start over.
Yeah, I apologize. So obviously in Minnesota, you know, you've got a shorter growing season, so you're not going to get that big biomass as much as we can down in the south. So in a corn soybean rotation, you know, that's going to be really difficult to really get that biomass to lay on the soil surface, to keep that soil covered, and to have those higher carbon and nitrogen ratios of that cover crop to help your soils out. And, you know, you could potentially plant soybeans early and then crimp rye later. But in all honesty, what you really need to probably be looking at is adding a third crop into that rotation of a small cereal grain, and then using a warm season cover crop blend in that to build your biomass during those, you know, July, August, September months before your first freeze.
Thank you, David. Shane, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, so David did a great job explaining, you know, adding diversity into the rotation. But the biggest thing would be to sit down with the renters and help kind of educate them the importance of applying the principles, you know, minimal disturbance, building that armor on the soil, the purpose of diversity of species. So it's really an education component, obviously, of how it can become economically beneficial for them. You know, reductions in nutrient cost, possibly herbicide usage. So not only the education aspect, but encouraging them to adopt some new things as being the landowner.
Along with that, Jason, I would add that we do have some good data from David Brandt that shows, as David said, diversifying the rotation, going with a corn, rye, soybean, winter wheat rotation over 3 years is actually more profitable than a corn, soybean, corn rotation. The other way we would start is, as with any of our clients who crop farm, we go out and we do soil testing. We pull a Haney soil test, a PLFA test, a total nutrient digestion test, and then we look at where the soil is at and educate them as to the cost savings that can be had according to where their soils are at biologically. Now, it's important, Jason, to remember that your family is the owner of the land, so the renters need to follow your wishes. And I know that may seem a little callous and abrupt, but if they truly want to rent the land from you, they need to be open-minded and take the suggestions. Now, how do you open their minds to this approach? Well, obviously you can help to educate them, as Shane said. We do offer a Regen Ag 101 course online. I would suggest that for your renters to get them familiar with regenerative agriculture and the approaches that we use. And then you can work with them and educate them beyond that point. Thank you for your question, Jason. Next question is from Rebecca. What's the best way to terminate grass to grow a vegetable garden for greens to sell at market and to have supplemental commercial rabbit feed? They're on a rabbitry on 1 acre in Texas. Alan, would you care to take a swing at that one, please?
Okay, so, oh, am I on mute? Or
Nope,
nope,
you're
nope.
good.
Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so terminating grass for a vegetable garden for greens and to have a supplemental commercial rabbit feed. And all of this is on 1 acre, correct?
Mhm.
Okay. It depends. The truth is, depends on the current situation of that garden. Remember with regenerative that all the tools are still in our toolbox and available to us to get things started. So again, a lot of it depends on what that grass is that's growing there. If it's, let's say, for instance, it's Bermuda grass. I'm not sure what part of Texas you're in, but if you're in the eastern part of Texas, it could be Bermuda grass, something like that. And that can be extremely difficult to eradicate out of a garden space like that. So, typically there's several ways to do this. You're going to have two of the ways to do this. You're going to have, some potential, downside to the practices, and you would have to look what you're going to do following those practices to build and rebuild biology. So one would be using a herbicide to burn down on the grass, the tillage, an initial tillage pass with no tillage after that. But the third way, and we use this quite a bit in our gardens, we have organic market gardens, and it works very well for us. We grow a lot of cover crops in between the vegetable crops, and then we also let nature sort of provide cover crops as well, and that's what most people are going to call weeds or forbs. We use a landscape tarp that is black on one side and white on the other, and it's a heavy tarp, and we just simply lay it down over that area. If it is wintertime and we're terminating, then we will turn the black side up to gather more heat for the soil. If it's summertime, we'll turn the white side up so that the soil stays cooler up underneath that tarp. And what you'll find is, and we use sandbags that we fill to just weight that tarp down, but you can use anything to weight it down. But what that'll do is that'll do an excellent job of terminating any kind of grass that's underneath. And you can just keep, usually it takes 8 to 10 days, maybe 14 days, and you can keep checking up underneath. And when all of that grass is degraded, then you're ready to go in and to plant whatever else you want to plant, your garden greens or whatever. So if you don't want to use a herbicide and you don't want to use tillage, then the heavy garden tarps are one of the very best ways to get that done.
I would certainly agree with what Alan stated there. I would encourage you to look at the book No-Till Intensive Vegetable Culture by Brian O'Hara. No-Till Intensive Vegetable Culture. He talks about solarization and the methods that Alan just described. In my opinion, Lori, for your size operation, that would be the best approach. Lori also tells us, keep doing what you're doing. It's a gift to the world. Thank you for that. We sincerely appreciate it. Franz asks, in a vegetable garden, have you found that vegetables such as brassicas prefer a bacterial dominant soil? I would expect that your own garden, Gabe, has a high fungal to bacterial ratio. If this is the case, would you optimize for lower succession plants, such as annual vegetables? Very good question. And realize that many of the brassicas do not form the association with mycorrhizal fungi. So they're going to prefer somewhat soils that are a bit more bacterial dominant. In saying that, we have no issues whatsoever of growing those brassicas in our fungal dominated soils. What brassicas are, though, many of them like nitrogen and they like to accumulate nitrogen. So what we prefer to do is to plant a diverse cover crop mix, and then that in my environment is terminated by winter. In environments further south, you could terminate it by rolling and then plant your brassicas into that. Provides good soil residual armor to inhibit weed growth and also provide some nitrogen for those brassicas. I'm a firm believer that we need more diversity even in vegetable gardens, and we actually like to rotate between a diverse cover crop and the vegetable garden. Shane or Ellen, anyone have any comments on that? Want to add?
I think you covered it pretty well, Gabe.
All right. Another question from Jason. What is behind the fear of planting into green and roller crimping? David, we'll start there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Some of the fear, I guess, is just the fear of the unknown. You know, like Alan previously had mentioned, that within regenerative ag is that we're not taking all the tools away from you. You know, rolling and crimping has to be done with the right species and at the right time to get a successful termination, but also to keep it to lay on that soil surface. And, you know, certain plant species of crops, we can roll with actually that plant with that crop up and growing and not even have an effect on the population or the stand count of that crop. Again, it's something that, you know, it's kind of new here in the last, I don't know, let's say 5 years or so in the ag world. And, you know, conventional mindset would say, oh, you cannot do that. You cannot do something like that or be in that field doing that after that crop has emerged. But we actually see some tremendous benefits to it.
Thank you, David. Along with that, Jason would like to know, are there any downsides to roller crimping versus herbicides?
You know, really using that roller crimper, depending on your context, where you live, if you can get that biomass and get that cover crop to mature, you know, enough to be able to roll and crimp. Obviously, like Gabe, in your environment, you know, you would struggle to get that cover crop to mature enough to have enough GDUs to plant your cash crop there too, and still terminate with a roller crimper. But, you know, as far as any downsides of roller crimping, the only downside would be if you're not monitoring, like if you're waiting until your crop is up and you're trying to roll and crimp and you're, you know, like let's say soybeans, if you knock off both cotyledons, that plant's done. If it's post or if it's after V3 stage, you know, you could have some damage to that stem and to that plant on the soybeans. On corn or milo, if that crown is above the soil surface, so basically V2 or later, you're going to probably, you know, break that plant off at the soil surface and you just inhibited your stand. Another consideration is that, you know, RMA for crop insurance does not recognize this as a standard practice. So, you know, if you're to go in and roller crimp a cover crop with a standing cash crop, that you would have to provide at least 3 years worth of data that showed that you did not lose any yield compared to not roller crimping it or roller crimping it beforehand. And also, you know, a extension or CCA advisor would have to write up an affidavit basically saying that, yes, this is a standard practice that is being done now to terminate cover crops.
And Jason, I would just add to that, David's last statement is one of the major hesitations of many producers. Let's be very honest. The current federal farm program is fairly antagonistic to these regenerative practices. And many producers do not want to take that financial risk. Next question is from Margaret, and Margaret lives in Southwest Iowa with highly contoured terraced land. Her question is, how can I best deal with this situation to add more diversity to my farm? David?
Well, again, I mean, adding another crop species in there would tremendously help. Instead of just, if it's a corn soybean, adding that small grain, would allow you the benefits of getting another, warm season diverse cover crop in there. If you have the ability to put up a fence and graze that is the absolute best way to provide a revenue stream off of that cover crop. But also, when we're looking at a lot of these row crop lands that if we're really wanting to regenerate land, we never see them fully regenerate and be as good as what they could be without having livestock on them. But the use of cover crops on that rolling land will absolutely help to keep those terrace channels from filling up with topsoil every time we get these heavy rain events. So we're going to reduce the erosion there. So you're going to have to spend less money, repairing those every, 5 to 10 years as well. So that's going to be a great benefit. Plus just keeping those nutrients in place and nutrient cycling as well. So that's going to be an economic gain. And if we can gain a big enough cover crop to help suppress out some weeds, I mean, that's another gain that we can reduce our herbicide expense.
Great points, David. Thank you. Alan Carter from Northeast Alabama has a problem with wild ryegrass coming through his cereal rye hairy vetch cover crop in a garden situation. Any thoughts?
Yeah, actually, the honest truth is this is a very similar solution as to what we talked about earlier. As a matter of fact, it's the exact same solution. It really doesn't matter what's growing there. You're going to terminate it with the landscape tarp. And again, we've had a very high level of success with that. We do it over and over again. What we find is that we get a ton of earthworm activity, and the decomposition of whatever's growing there, gets reincorporated back into the soil. So that's new carbon, new organic matter to feed the next, cash crop, vegetable crop that we're planting. And it allows us to do this with tillage. I would actually, Gabe, make the same recommendation here of using the landscape tarp to terminate that.
I certainly agree with that.
Hey,
Shane,
Dave.
Margaret, David, did you have a comment?
Yeah, one thing I would like to add to that, in between your rows during the growing season, after you take that tarp off, you might get some late successionary plants, as we call it, some people call them weeds, to come up. And you can actually buy rolls of cardboard and at different widths, and you could roll it out in between those rows and actually be able to suppress out the weeds there. And like Alan said, earthworms absolutely love that type of environment too, so that can help.
Yeah, another thing that I use on our farm in the garden is alfalfa hay. And I like alfalfa hay because higher in nitrogen, it's going to be broken down very quickly. But if you put on a mat of it between the rows, it will inhibit those weeds from coming. Shane, Margaret asks and says, I've been paying for cover crops on my farm for 6 years, yet my farm operator complains about the fact that cover crops are stealing moisture from the cash crop when he plants each spring, especially in years like this when we're in a drought situation. Margaret believes the opposite. She states that the operator terminates before planting. Margaret thinks he should plant into the cover crop green. Do you have any comments?
Well, it's one of those situations. If we've been doing this for 6 years, I would be questioning the cover crop mixes. you're in a humid enough area, we should be building some pretty good aggregate structure. So probably one approach I would look at for sure is taking the Haney and PLFA test. Let's see where we're at in the system so we can start designing cover crop mixes to meet your resource concerns. So if we're having a problem with, obviously it sounds like we're not infiltrating water into the system. So we need to address why that's occurring. Is there not enough armor on the soil? Are they bailing off residue? Are we grazing off too much? What's our crop rotation? So if she would like to reach out to me or contact Kathy, I would be more inclined to visit with her more in depth about this and help her with her Haney soils information.
Okay. Margaret, please send a note to Kathy at understandingag.com. Alan, you have pointed out that fly control in cattle is a nutritional deficiency. Is that also true with fleas in cats and dogs? Now, there's a question we haven't had before.
Yeah, so almost every issue that we encounter relative to heavy parasite loads, either internal or external parasites. So in this case, you're asking about flies, but internal and external parasite issues are heavily due to the diet and the diversity of that diet, particularly relative to the phytonutrient compounds, the secondary and tertiary compounds we describe them, and as Dr. Fred Provenza describes them in his book Nourishment and a lot of his research. They have a large measure of control over, the degree of infestation that we're going to see on our pet and our life. And as you're probably well aware, the vast majority of commercial pet diets now, when you go and buy a bag of dog food or cat food or whatever, they are woefully inadequate. It's no better than a typical, cattle feedlot TMR ration in that regard. You're not going to have a high level of fiber.
Oh, Alan broke up on us. Okay. We will move on here. Karen asks, in regards to grazing cattle, will kelp help fill the void until soil improves with diversity? And Karen, yes, there has been documented both research and anecdotal that shows that some good forms of kelp do provide many of these micronutrients, and that would certainly help. Shane, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you're pretty well covered.
Next question is from Luke, and Shane, I'll address this to you. Does adding livestock to the farm necessitate direct marketing to be a profitable enterprise?
No, it does not. Necessitate direct marketing, but if you don't have livestock on your operation and you're adding, different disruptions such as planting cereals, biennials, then planting warm seasons, and you're growing some biomass, it's a great way to capture some economic gain through a grazing activity and just adding weight back on the livestock, and then marketing the livestock, through a conventional market. We always look to see where we can capture additional value or profit. And, part of the direct marketing is to capture the highest part of the market that you possibly can, but it does not mean you have to do that. So, you got to do what's comfortable for you and your operation, your family, to be successful.
Shane's absolutely right, Luke. It's about context and your context. Can direct marketing increase profitability? Yes, if it fits your context. But in saying that, we work with many operators who do not direct market, and they are realizing real financial benefits from grazing animals on their operations, not to mention the improvement to the soil ecosystem. So David, Greg asks, he's growing corn in 60-inch rows with up to 15 species interseeded cover crop. He's 100% no-till, non-GMO, only uses herbicides when needed, but no insecticides or seed treatments. He would like to continue these practices and use legumes as a nitrogen source, but he's seeing his corn struggle a bit. Any ideas or suggestions for Greg?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd have to know a little bit more history about the soil health, looking at the Haney test and the PLFA test as well, to know if your soil was actually ready to go into a system like that. You know, it seems too many times that we see a lot of guys, you know, that call us up and are talking about interseeding or 60-inch rows. And it's kind of that hot topic on you know, Facebook and on social media right now from practices. But what we see is that their soils aren't ready for that. So, you know, the corn crop itself will struggle. They end up having a lot of weed pressure that comes in there as well. But, you know, also realize that, you know, that cover crop that we grow prior to that corn crop can be helping with our weed suppression, but also that helps to break down, mineralize those nutrients depending on our health of the soil, what our carbon to nitrogen ratio would be of that cover crop mix. But that can help to provide that, you know, early season nutrients for that corn crop. You know, corn is kind of a weak child, if you will. Like it doesn't like to have a bad day. If it has a bad day, it curls up and it cries in a ball, basically. And so when we see that corn's a little pale and it's a little off colored and all the neighbors' corn is dark green, we think, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with it. Well, early on in the season, it can handle more of that stress than later in the season. So if it's your first year doing the 60-inch, I would say not to stress too much about it and see what it does later. But when we're going into these type of practices, we really need to be looking at what kind of hybrids and genetics that we're actually planting to make sure that they can handle, you know, when we're looking at a 60-inch corn, if we're typically planting 30,000 population on 30s, we're going to be planting 60,000 in 60. So we got to make sure that that plant can handle that much root competition next to each other. And then the other thing is, you know, those cover crops that we seed in between there, let's say it's a mung bean and a cowpea, well, they're not really going to start forming much nodulation, you know, for maybe 30 days after planting. And so if we're hoping to capture that extra nitrogen that's out of that cover crop and to make our crops look really good, we're kind of deceiving ourselves. We got to be really honest about that and make sure that, you know, depending on how far advanced our soil systems are, of supplementing some nutrients early on to get us to that stage where we can maybe start sharing some of those nutrients back and forth through mycorrhizal colonization of both the corn and the legumes to share those nutrients. But again, it goes back to doing those PLFA tests and the Haney tests to actually find out where we're at in the system.
Thank you, David. Andrew asks, I have some difficulty getting good seed to soil contact when planting through covers that are laying on the soil surface. And Andrew, I would need to know a little more. I would need to know what type of equipment you have. But with much of the equipment today, as long as you have good down pressure, sharp discs, you should be able to cut through that residue, especially if you wait until conditions are right, not seed when that residue is really damp, and you should be able to get through there. I always joke that with my 1590 John Deere drill, the only thing I can't seed into is cement and asphalt. David, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd also be checking your closing wheel pressure too. You know, if you're trying to push a lot of down pressure on the front on those disc blades, and you also have a lot of closing wheel pressure, you're actually counterbalancing that row unit out, and so you're not actually getting it in as deep as what you should be. And another thing is, you know, obviously planting green is easier to slice through that residue than planting something that isn't quite brown dead yet. You know, if we're going to terminate that cover crop prior to it and then plant through it, it's got to be brown dead to get through there without having any hairpinning issues or having that seed sit on top of that soil profile or on top of that residue as well. Yeah, I mean, that'd be the biggest things I'd say.
Good points, David. Martin asked, what kind of real expectations and potential in terms of improving soil organic matter in poor sandy soil in Arizona type weather if applying all of the regenerative ag principles? Shane?
So exactly what kind of expectations in sandy soils? Well, you know, it's going to go back to, you know, being intentional, making sure you keep the principles in place, obviously. And first thing, we got to grow some biomass. But also, you got to remember, you're in a warm environment down there. So even once you do start growing vegetation and start improving soil microbiology, we got to keep them fed because they're going to stay active longer. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult in those more warmer climates to build organic matter versus the northern environments where they get colder earlier and the microbiology kind of slows down. So they're not actively functioning per se as it would be in the Arizona environment. You know, to give a real, that's a guessing game. I mean, if you get a year where we can catch some rains, we can grow a lot of biomass. Yeah, we're going to grow some organic matter fast. But if we don't keep feeding the system, we're going to chew it right back up.
Yep, you're correct, Shane. Maria asks, how can I protect my squash and pumpkin plants from vine borer in southeastern Texas? Who would like to handle that one? Vine borers freeze to death in North Dakota. I can't answer that one. I would say it has to do with predatory insects, and are you providing the home and habitat for predators that would feed on vine borers? And I apologize, Maria, I don't think any of us on this call are experts in vine borers, but we will try and find out for you. Okay. Eric asks, what are your thoughts on foliar feeding crops with melted urea, liquid Foss, and micronutrients during the growing season? Shane or David?
David, why don't you take this one real quick?
I'm sorry, my phone completely broke up for a couple minutes there. I missed the entire question.
Okay. Eric is asking, what are your thoughts on foliar feeding crops with melted urea, liquid Foss, and micronutrients during the growing season?
Obviously, I'd probably pull a tissue test first. I'd like to see what my plant is actually missing instead of taking a shotgun approach out there and trying to hit it with everything. I'd want to use a rifle approach and know exactly what I'm putting my money into to see if it actually needs those nutrients or not. You know, melted urea or liquid urea is a really good form of nitrogen. You know, when we're complexing with everything else, you got to make sure that we're not going to have any leaf injury burns or anything like that, because as soon as we injure that leaf tissue, now we're opening it up to a lot of pathogen pressure as well. So, you know, is it a good tool? Absolutely. But I would want to really monitor it before I just go out there and start broadcasting an application.
Thank you, David. Another part of that question is, would a foliar application at a much lower rate be less invasive to soil biology? Shane.
Well, it's going to be more practical. I mean, so over application, obviously, the soil microbiology is going to consume a lot of that synthetic nutrient or capture all those nutrients within their metabolism in their own bodies. So yeah, doing multiple applications of nutrients, you're going to be far more successful with it. But I totally agree with what David was saying. You know, we need to do some tissue sampling, knowing what we need, and also doing the Haney test prior, you know, to seeding. Let's find out, you know, what we have functioning within our soils and make nutrient applications based upon some testing instead of, like David was saying, a shotgun approach.
Very good reply, Shane. Alan, Jason would like to know, what resources do you recommend for grass-fed and pastured proteins? Any good online programs or consultants? We don't know any good consultants, do we, Alan? Oh, you're on mute, Alan.
I'm sorry. When I had to log back in after the internet kicked me off, I lost the entire list of questions, so I no longer have those. So when he's asking about protein, is he asking about protein supplementation?
No, he's asking about pastured proteins, marketing, you know, grass-fed beef and other pastured meats.
Okay, so what resources are good? Well, first of all, you know, check out our website at understandingag.com and go to two places. First, go to on the resources page, go to from our experts. We have a whole host of archived articles with a number of those articles providing valuable information relative to that that'll help you there on the marketing and how to properly describe your attributes and so forth. And then secondly, we have archived webinars that deal specifically with these types of topics that are also available to you. So I would advise start there. And then if you have further questions, as Gabe said, we are right here. So all you got to do is, you know, contact Kathy at understandingag.com, and we'd be happy to answer any specific questions that you may have after that.
Yeah. And Jason is asking about any good consultants. Jason, I would just argue that the gentleman who just answered that question is probably the premier pastured protein consultant certainly in North America. And so feel free to reach out to our team at any time. Jason also asks Alan that he hears a lot about limited meat processing capacity. Is this being resolved?
So that's a very good question. And there's actually several things that are happening right now. One is there is new processing capacity that is being built out in a number of different areas of the country. And however, most of that build out takes time. And so with what is occurring right now, we're looking at 2022 realistically before a lot of that comes online. However, the other thing that we've noted is that in 2020, because of all the COVID scare and everything, that a lot of people pre-booked for 2021 into a lot of these processing plants. And now I've actually had a number of processors that have contacted me recently, letting me know that they actually now do have some slots available, that many of the people that pre-booked, they overestimated, frankly, what they were going to send for 2021 this year, and they're not sending them to the plant. So those plants are starting to open back up. in terms of kill and processing capacity. I'd be happy if you let me know the specific area that you're in. I'd be happy to look into that and to see what type of processing options are available to you right now, and then what may be coming down the line for 22 and 23.
Mhm. Thank you, Alan. Mark states that he's starting to see bindweed creeping into his fields. What cover crop needs to be introduced to help retard the growth of bindweed? Mark, I would just say that you need to ask the question instead, what is that bindweed telling you? And we often see bindweed move in when you have compacted soils. So I would like to take a look at the aggregation of that soil, and chances are that it's not very well aggregated. So how do you correct that? In order to build soil aggregates, we need grass type species that form the association with mycorrhizal fungi, and we need biology. So a diverse cover crop mix that is strong on grasses would be a good approach to start. Shane, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree totally. And, also, get that armor on that soil so we keep that microbiology active. Because remember, they work in a subaquatic environment, so we need that moisture for them to be able to do what they need to do.
Thank you, Shane. Jacob asks, we are planting cover crops for cattle and goat forage. We have just started and looking for an effective termination method between crops that would not require a herbicide. Beyond grazing it out, could shredding be used effectively to terminate the cover crop before the next crop? Alan?
Okay. So one of the very best ways that we control things like that is through being able to increase bricks in those plants. What we have found is that improved bricks content, basically significant, particularly soft-bodied insects like this, but also hard-bodied insects, it significantly reduces the amount of predation that they're going to have there. And I'm assuming you're saying that you already have a cutworm infestation there right now.
You jumped a question ahead, Alan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep. We're asking about, Jacob is planting cover crops for cattle and goat forage, and he's looking for a termination method without the use of herbicide. He is wondering if shredding would work to effectively terminate the cover crop before the next seeding.
Okay. Shredding can help. Yes. I sort of hesitate to do that. I like to do, if at all possible, I like to do a terminal graze instead, and go in with that. But if you can't get a good terminal graze in there, then going in and mowing or shredding can certainly be one way to help in that regard without having to use some type of herbicide. What you do have to remember is that with that, again, if you shred, then there is the possibility that with the new cover crop coming back up, some of that old cover crop can, still come in there and potentially shade things out. And some of that is just maybe accepting, a portion of that occurring. We don't ever use herbicides to terminate between one and the other. We simply do a terminal graze, and that terminal graze is not really grazing down very short. Rather, it's a higher density graze where we're getting a fairly high degree of trample or insult on that. And we actually prefer that to any type of herbicide burn down or a shredding, because that terminal grazing at a higher density gives us a significant fertility application. And it also allows us to be able to stimulate the biology, which is vital for germination and early seedling vigor of that new planting.
Thank you, Alan. Now we'll get on to the question about the cutworm infestation. David, I'm going to call on you here. Martin says that he has a cutworm infestation in his summer cover crop mix. He plans to graze it soon. Would you spray insecticides? What about BT and BV and that sort of biological entomopathogens? That's a new word for me. Okay, David?
You know, excuse me. Kind of like what Alan was saying, if we have higher bricks content, those cutworms, you know, higher sugar content, basically those cutworms are basically like diabetics. So if they were to eat on those plants, then they would basically die. But I have a little bit of concern if it's cutworm and it's entering those plants, and you're getting ready to graze, you know, depending on the plant species and when we're grazing, we shouldn't probably be grazing some of these warm seasons until they're at least 20 plus inches tall, and preferably closer to probably 30. And by that stage, those cutworms shouldn't be affecting those plants at all. They should be outgrowing those. Yes, there's some BT, there's some organic, you know, basically BT that you can spray on and possibly control them. You know, if you got chickens, run chickens through there, they'll eat them. But, you know, there's some chemistries that we could spray on to control the cutworm issues out there. I'd probably just want to know what percentage of the field is infestated, and how much are taking.
That's correct, David. And I would like to ask the question, Martin, of you, you know, are you providing home and habitat for the predatory insects? Obviously, our preferred choice of control would be through predatory insects. Now, yes, it's too late this year, but I think it is in everyone's best interest on their farm or ranch to have the habitat available for those beneficial insects. And so that's a long-term approach, but one that we need to think of. Okay, Alan and Shane, I have a couple questions that are closely related, so I'm going to meld them together. And they both talk about the issues with weeds in pasture. For instance, musk thistle, Canada thistle. How do you control that? Are you better off spraying it? And then also, should one be going in and rolling down the weeds in a pasture to allow grasses to grow? That's a kind of a wide open question, but who wants to take that one first?
I'll start off first. I'll give the short brief answers. I'll let Alan give the in-depth details. So, you know, if you're dealing with like musk thistle and stuff, you know, you can use different stalk densities, impacts, try to walk a lot of that down. They will consume some of the heads. If that doesn't do a sufficient enough job, you know, and they are going to go to seed and they are an issue, you may consider shredding them. But I would try to get the biological stimulation with the manure urine in there with the cattle, you know, to wake up some of that seed bank that's down below. So I get some more diversity of species in there come later on in the season or even next year. Rolling down weeds with grasses, you know, I would recommend doing that. You know, I'd still utilize animal impact. I mean, a lot of those weed species, you know, cattle will consume those. They'll also trample them down so we can sequester those nutrients back through the system. It's that hoof and manure and urine action that helps stimulate that microbiology in the soil. It helps start building that aggregate. It helps with the water infiltration, oxygen in the soil, and waking up a lot of new species and starting that succession process of advancing the system into more grasses.
Alan?
I totally agree with that. There's very few weeds that, with the right stock density and frequency of movement that your livestock won't eat. And, again, we've mentioned the work of Dr. Fred Provenza several times this evening in his book, Nourishment. But again, many of these plants that we call weeds are actually incredibly nutritious and highly medicinal and even anti-parasitic in nature. So that would always be my first choice, is to go in and to graze under higher density to get both a good trample on what you would call weeds and the grasses that are growing there. A lot of biological stimulation and fertility applied, as we said earlier. And yes, to teach them how to eat those weeds. I'll give you a specific example. We were teaching workshops for the Noble Research Institute. And at that workshop on one of their ranches, we took a naive set of heifers that had never really been grazed before under higher density. And we put them into a pasture that had some native grasses, but it also had quite a bit of blackberry, buckbrush, and thistle. And these heifers had never been taught to eat any of that before, but yet the very first day, under significantly higher density, many of the heifers in that group sampled all of that and then went back during the course of that 24-hour period and ate a significant portion of all of those things that we consider to be weeds and broadsheet species. Then the next day, when we took that same set of heifers and turned them into a new paddock under a lower density, they went and found every thistle in that pasture first and gnawed it all the way to the ground. So graze it. That's what you need to do.
Exactly. Thank you, Alan. Daniel tells us that he planted soybeans green into cereal rye at anthesis. No row cleaners, using Copperhead Ag closing wheels on a 1770 planter. Roller crimped immediately after planting. He saw great weed control between the rows, but weeds in the row with the beans. No pre-emergent herbicide was applied. He didn't feel he had a lot of residue disturbance in the row. In other words, he did not see much bare soil. Suggestions to eliminate that problem of weeds in the row.
I guess I need a little bit more context, knowing, what the seeding rate of the cereal rye was, and also what the row width spacing was of that cereal rye. Obviously, a little bit higher rates or closer together seeding spacing can definitely help with that. But even at that, depending on the conditions at planting time, it doesn't take a lot of soil disturbance. If it's just a little bit tacky and you get a little bit of moisture build up on those disc blades or on your closing wheels or even on your gauge wheels, that could be just enough to start some germination in the row. Depending on how much weeds are out there and what weed species there are, it might not have an impact on that crop. Realize that if you were to look at any herbicide out there and look at the independent trial research and even university trial research, 90% control is considered excellent. So, if you've got 10% weeds out in your field, just consider that as the industry standard of excellent. And would it warrant going out there and trying to spray something to control that or not? I mean, that'd be one of the things I'd be questioning myself with that. But those are some of the questions, you know, regarding the planting of that rye that I'd want to know a little bit more about.
Okay, Daniel, if you would like, please email Kathy at Understanding Ag, and she will get you in touch with David. Here you go, Alan. Here's a very good comment from Mark and question. We discovered Regen Ag while researching biblical stewardship online. Our goal then and now is to determine how to give the land a year of rest on the 7th year.
Yeah, so if you look at, you know, what is described as the sabbatical year, you know, then that is the year of rest on the 7th year. And then, of course, you have the year of Jubilee, which occurred every 49 years, you know, so every 7 sevens. But if you really study what happened during the sabbatical year, then you'll notice in Scripture that it clearly says the land, it was not what we may think of as a complete rest. As a matter of fact, on that 7th year, that land that was being rested was actually grazed by their livestock. Okay, that's critically important. So, in other words, God ordained that full restoration of that land had to occur through the biological and fertility stimulation of the livestock on that land. It was not devoid of livestock. So I think we need to remember that and understand that was critical for recovery of that land.
Thank you, Alan. Next question is from Wyatt. Wyatt's in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I have some mixed native range pasture with 0.5% organic matter, poor phosphorus index. Currently using AMP grazing at 4,000 to 6,000 pounds per acre with small ruminants. What is a great way to increase organic matter and reduce the erosion and bare areas in heavy clay soils? You know, is Alejandro still on, or we might have just lost him?
I think we lost him. Okay.
Okay. Alan, do you care to take that one, please?
Okay, let's go repeat that question for me, Gabe.
Yep.
Again,
I'm
trying to find it.
I'm in the chat.
Oh, in the chat. Okay.
Yep, I moved over to the chat. First question on chat from Wyatt. Low organic matter soils, 4,000 to 6,000 pounds per acre, AMP grazing with small ruminants. How does the increased soil organic matter reduce erosion in bare areas? Okay.
Yeah, and that's part of, I lost all those the earlier chat questions too, but I do remember reading that one earlier. And so when you have bare areas and things like that, and you're only impacting it with 4,000 to 6,000 pounds per acre, it's going to be hard for the livestock impact alone to have a significant impact or very quickly, you know, recover those areas. So you're going to have to think of some other strategies in combination with that. One would be if you can work with a neighbor that has some large ruminants, you know, cattle, that could come in and graze that at some point in time under a much higher stock density. So that's one of the things that you might consider. Another thing that you can consider is you know, going in there and bale grazing over those areas with your small ruminants. Now, again, though, you know, you would have to be very careful in how you do that and make sure that you get the right kind of impact and get that hay spread out like you need it. You could also unroll the bales on those areas and let your small ruminants feed on those unrolled rolls of hay. You know, I know one of the things that Shane has done successfully on some bare areas is to just go get loads of wood chips and apply those as a mulch over those areas, because that is carbon. So any kind of carbon that you can apply over those areas to protect them, the soil moisture intent, and to stimulate that latent seed bank and get it growing there is going to be beneficial to you. Shane, anything to add?
I think
I'm
you
gonna
pretty
add-
well addressed it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to
Alejandro's
ask Alejandro. I see Alejandro is on. Alejandro, best ways to reduce erosion and fill in bare areas in a pasture.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we actually, where we ranch, there's a lot of bare spots. We ranch in the Chihuahuan Desert. And we actually get into the discipline of actually working where we have the grass and the bare areas. We have applied some bale grazing, but one key ingredient there is to be patient, because even just having the hoof action on the bare areas, something will come up. Something very important as well is to provide these long rest periods, so you allow whatever is going to chop there, weeds or annuals or grasses, just to express themselves. So don't go and do that, what we call rotational overgrazing, because then we will not allow those species coming up from that bare ground to show up.
Thank you, Alejandro. Next question is from Ike, and Ike states, first time cover crop grower. He put in a 5 species diverse mix, but it's getting too dry for all of them to grow. Wondering next year going forward if he should maybe try 2 cereals and 1 legume, because they're larger seed size. They average 6 to 7 inches of rain, not getting that much this year. And I would state, Ike, that no, you are better off with a diverse mix, but you need to pay attention to seeds per acre. We have seen over and over again that diversity is king. And if you have different plant species with different root types, different rooting depths, that along with mycorrhizal fungi will move nutrients, including water, throughout the soil profile. We see much greater production in diverse mixes as compared to less diverse mixes. Now, one thing you can run into, though, is simply too many plants per square foot. So I would encourage you to continue with diverse mixes in that situation, but pay attention to the number of plants per square foot. What kind of real expectations can one have in poor? Okay, we answered that question already. Can I mention the book again about vegetable production? It's No-Till Intensive Vegetable Culture by Brian O'Hara. No-Till Intensive Vegetable Culture. Okay. We answered that one. Here's in the chat, there's some good discussion on different books that people recommend. Okay, here's another question. Trying to grow winter wheat regeneratively, is there a best crop to be planted prior, such as corn or soybeans, or others? He is in Indiana, stating that most plant soybeans prior, others plant corn prior. David.
Yeah, so in my preference, I'd rather plant the legume prior to a grass. So I'd rather plant that soybean prior to the wheat, being that it's going to have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So as it's the leaves and the petioles are decomposing and mineralizing out after harvest, that it's going to be releasing those nutrients so the wheat can actually take it up. You know, it can save you some money there. I will caution you, if you're using cereal rye in that part of Indiana and trying to take it to anthesis and roll it down or anything like that prior to planting wheat, that there's a good opportunity that you could have some volunteer cereal rye into your wheat, which, you know, can cause some heartaches at the elevator and either get, you know, severely docked or even loads rejected if it's too high a percentage of cereal rye. So you may want to look at using maybe, you know, on the fields that you plan to go to wheat the following year after soybeans or that fall, using a different cover crop prior to soybeans, or just terminating that cover crop, you know, maybe around flag leaf stage before it gets up to producing viable seed heads as well.
Thank you, David. Here's a question from Martin. In sorghum, sudan, millets, beans, sunflower, okra, buckwheat, summer cover crop mix, how soon or how can you tell when it is ready to be grazed? It's knee-high now. Is there any risk involved in starting the grazing now? Ellen or Shane?
Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, with you know, the mix like that, and you know, that's a summer annual mix. You do have sorghum sudan in there, which is going to grow pretty tall, and of course you have the millets. The first question that I would ask is, you know, how long has it been since it was planted and has germinated? Typically, I like to see at least 50 days and a lot of times 60 days before I'm going to start the grazing. And I like to see at least 3 foot of height, you know, on this before I start that initial graze, to even well over 40 inches before I start the initial graze on a mix like this. And that first graze, you know, particularly with your sorghum sudan and millets, if you want to have good regrowth and get repeated grazing on it, you know, keep them grazing high and do not let them take it down more than, you know, 16 to 20 inches in total height. And really, I prefer them not to take it down lower than 2 feet in total height on the initial grazes before any type of terminal graze. Shane?
No, I agree totally, Alan. If you're going to be coming through there, I'd like it for it to be at least 36 inches tall minimum. And if I'm forced where I might have to graze it, that, I mean, I'll only clip the top third at the most. Be moving those cattle pretty rapidly. Make sure you're addressing your resource concerns, as in livestock nutrition. You know, what class of livestock you're running through there, and you know, other things to consider also.
Next question is from Jennifer, and she addresses it to me, wanting to know if I have any observations to share regarding how Regen pastures have fared in comparison to conventionally grazed pastures during the drought in the Dakotas. Yes, Jennifer, there are stark differences. One thing I would just like to say up front is it's my belief that no one should talk about a drought unless you've had 3 successive years of less than 50% normal precipitation. It really amazes me how some areas of the plains here have had decent moisture the past few years, and this is their first dry year, and they're complaining that they're in a drought. Well, they're in a drought because they have not made their soils resilient by applying these principles. We're actually here in our 6th year in a row of significantly below normal precipitation. Up to this point on our ranch, we have not reduced animal numbers to any great extent. Now, that is going to change. We are starting to reduce livestock numbers. And you just have to be proactive rather than reactive. I would like to call on Alejandro because he's an expert in limited moisture environments to talk about what modifications can be made during drought conditions. Alejandro?
Yes, thank you, Gabe. We actually experienced one of the worst droughts in probably in the last 40 years. Last year in the Chihuahuan Desert, and there was actually a common denominator of who actually made it okay and who did not make it. And some of the few things that we observe is those people who actually got like inventory of their grasses at the end of the growing season, and then get the proper stock numbers to match with that grass, to be able to go all the way through the next 12 months without any more rain. And the other factor that we saw in those people that did it successfully with just like a 3-inch rain precipitation instead of like 10, 12 inches precipitation, were the ones that were providing these long rest periods. They're grazing sometimes just once a year. I mean, a good intensive grazing, but just once a year. So they were able to stockpile a lot of grass. Another very important factor was the people who were selecting for cattle that is adapted to their environment. Those were the ones that actually cattle were helping them instead of being a hindrance. From what I remember, those were one of the key ingredients of people being able to deal with such a low precipitation in a very tough year.
Thank you, Alejandro. Very good points. Here's another question, David. The attendee asks, with my hilly contoured land in southwest Iowa, I'm frustrated with limited options for seeding cover crops. So far, I've only used aerial seeding with mixed stand results. I'm interested in single pass seeding via an air seeder mounted on the combine head. Do you have any advice as to that practice?
Yeah, so it's a good practice. Again, you know, it depends on what species we're seeding. It's primarily using like cereal rye and blowing that seed underneath that head. You'll probably get, I would say, potentially you could get better stand establishment than you could with aerial application. The one thing that, you know, I'll advise anybody on that's using aerial application is that most of the time when we're looking at seeding rates, and you look at all these guides and everything that give you a seeding rate, you know, based on drilling, and if we're flying on a cover crop, you really probably need to be increasing the rates by maybe 30 to even up to 40% to get about as a consistent stand as you would if you were to drill that cover crop in after harvest. The other thing with flying on is to watch how much of that open canopy you have to get down into that, get good seed soil contact at that time, and it's not just hanging up in that leaf tissue of the corn plant. So going back to your question with using a Gandy or something on the corn head or soybean platform, there's a lot of people that are using that method, and it actually works pretty good because, you know, think about you're laying that residue right on top of that seed. So if you get some, you know, even in late or in the early fall where you might catch some dew, you know, that could be enough dew to actually start the initial germination process. If you catch some rain, you can get it, you know. So yeah, that is definitely an option to help save some time and some expense of seeding that cover crop rather than going out there and making a second pass.
Thank you, David. Alejandro, Katie replies to you. Great, Alejandro. Thank you for your answer on arid lands and ranchers surviving the drought. She asks you this: does the potential for wildfire figure into your calculus of when and where to graze?
Yeah, obviously, before we did not have any fires because we did not have pretty much any grass actually. But yeah, but right now that's part of the equation that you need to take into account. We sometimes graze some strips in order to prevent that fire from spreading too fast and too wide, and that's part of the management as well. Yeah, but there are fires when you're doing this intensive grazing in arid areas. But when we grazed more intensively, that's actually, there are two factors that your fire will not be the same. One is that you graze more intensively, and the other is that because you're infiltrating more water and you're retaining more humidity, more moisture, then the fires will be less intense than when you have those soils very compacted.
Thank you, Alejandro. Alan, final question here, unless someone else adds one. Do you recommend seeding covers on worn out steep grade pastures?
You're on mute, Alan.
Okay,
Alan?
so seeding covers on worn out steep grade pastures. You know, the truth is you're probably far better off going in there and, first of all, giving those areas a long rest, trying to build up as much natural biomass as possible, and then using higher stock density in those areas to be able to elicit, you know, biological impact and to tap that latent seed bank and to grow a lot more biomass there. The other thing that you can do on steep ground is, you know, obviously if there's an effective and efficient way to get up above that and to be able to unroll hay, you know, down those slopes and to allow your livestock to graze on that, that's another way that we have been successful at managing some steeper land. So that certainly would be an option for you relative to that. Gabe, I do also see a question regarding the use of South Pole cattle.
Okay.
I'd be happy to address that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the question is, do you have an opinion on South Pole cattle used in a MIG grazing system and marketing the beef as grass-finished, direct marketed beef? I don't have a problem with the South Pole cattle at all. Where I'd have the problem actually is with a MIG grazing system to finish them on. You know, you really need an adaptive grazing system to finish those cattle best and to have the highest quality end product. We actually use quite a bit of South Pole cattle in our mix. We have a lot of South Pole and Red Angus that we're using, and they work incredibly well for our deep South environment. As a matter of fact, I was out there at the farm this afternoon, a pretty hot afternoon, and I can tell you that those South Pole in the middle of the heat, you know, were out there grazing with no problem at all, whereas the much higher percentage Red Angus and Black Angus, you know, were hunting shade. And the South Pole were super slick. We could see the happy lines on their sides. You know, so for really good South Pole cattle, they're an excellent choice in our part of the country.
Alan, here's another question, if you would. Shannon asked, you mentioned teaching animals to eat thistle. Have you had any luck getting them to eat common ragweed?
Oh, yes, Shannon. Common ragweed is actually pretty easy to get them to eat. And it's very nutrient dense. It's an excellent forage for cattle, just like giant ragweed is. Higher density, you know, plain and simple, typically does the trick. And here's one thing that everybody needs to consider when you're wanting your livestock to eat a much more diverse diet, including the things that we call weeds, is that their propensity to do so starts in the womb. So, you know, when you are grazing your pregnant animals, particularly in that last trimester, that third trimester, try to have them on as diverse a pasture as you can, and particularly pastures that may be sort of weedy. Have them grazing there during that third trimester, and that's going to start teaching those calves in utero that it's okay to eat that type of plant, because they are literally tasting those flavors in utero. And then once they're born, have those cows grazing on those same types of pastures, and those calves are learning very early on, all of this is fair game.
I would certainly concur with that, Alan. With that, I am going to share, this slide here of our upcoming webinars. On Thursday, July 8th at 7 p.m. Central, we will be having a webinar, Increasing Profitability in a Corn Soybean Rotation, with panelists Dan DeSutter, David Brandt, and David Kleinschmidt. We welcome and hope that you would join us for that. As always, if you want to learn more about topics we discussed this evening and more about regenerative ag, you can purchase our online course, Regen Ag 101, or look at our website, soilhealthacademy.org or understandingag.com. With that, we want to thank everyone for joining us here. We hope you have a very healthy, happy, and prosperous year. Thank you, everyone.